Have you ever felt like you're chasing happiness, but no matter how far you run, it always slips away? What if the problem isn't the world around you, but the way you see it? This is the story of a man who was trapped in his own mind, until he discovered a truth that changed everything. And it might just change you too. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subs. Your support is what keeps us creating more inspiring content. A life on repeat. The ceiling fan spun in slow, methodical circles, stirring the stale air of Anime's small apartment. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, fingers woven together in a tense clasp. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside. Distant but ever present, like a reminder that life moved on whether he did or not. It was another morning, another start to what felt like the same day he had lived 1,000 times before. Wake up, go to work, come home, try to distract himself with television or his phone, and then lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all life had to offer. He had everything a person was supposed to need: a steady job, a place to live, no major crises looming over him, but inside, there was a persistent emptiness, a sense that something was missing. He exhaled heavily and ran a hand through his dark, unkempt hair. Maybe it was the routine that made life feel so dull. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't quite have the words for. Either way, the feeling had been growing, like a slow-spreading shadow, creeping into every corner of his existence. The day unfolded as predictably as every other. He commuted through packed streets, where people rushed past each other, eyes fixed on their phones or the pavement, lost in their own worries. Work was a blur of deadlines, emails, and forced small talk. By the time he returned home, the sky had dimmed, casting a cool, blue-gray light over the city. Sitting at his kitchen table, a half-eaten dinner in front of him, he stared at the window. His reflection looked back at him, tired and distant. What was he even doing? Working to afford a life that felt increasingly meaningless? He remembered when he used to have dreams, when he believed that life had purpose. Somewhere along the way, that belief had faded. He closed his eyes and tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him. He had read about people who found peace, people who seemed to understand something he didn't. Was there really a way to live without this constant sense of unease? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. A message from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. If you're looking for answers, sometimes you have to start by asking the right questions. Anime stared at the screen. The words felt oddly well-timed, like a whisper from the universe. He tapped out a reply, hesitated, then deleted it. Instead, he found himself searching for something, anything, that could explain what he was feeling. That's when he stumbled upon a passage, an old teaching attributed to the Buddha. The mind is everything. What you think, you become. His eyes lingered on the words. Something about them struck him, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a direct challenge. If his mind was shaping his life, then what had he been creating for himself? For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. A question surfaced, quiet but insistent. What if there was another way to live? A chance encounter? Anime wandered through the city streets, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his jacket. The evening air carried a slight chill, wrapping around him like the weight of his own thoughts. He wasn't sure why he had decided to take this walk, only that he couldn't stand the silence of his apartment any longer. That quote he had read earlier still lingered in his mind. The mind is everything. What you think, you become. Was that true? Could it really be that simple? If his thoughts had shaped his life, then what did that say about the restless dissatisfaction he had been carrying for so long? He sighed and kept walking, weaving through the crowd. The streets were alive with movement. People rushing home from work. Couples strolling hand in hand. Vendors closing up their stalls for the night. It was a scene he had seen countless times. Yet tonight, something felt different. He stopped in front of a small bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. The place looked old. Its wooden sign faded from years of exposure to the elements. The warm glow from inside cast long, inviting shadows on the sidewalk. Without fully understanding why, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scent of aged paper and ink filled the air. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books that seemed to have been there for decades. There was no music playing, just the faint sound of pages being turned somewhere in the back. Anime wandered between the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of books without really seeing them. His mind was elsewhere, caught between curiosity and skepticism. He wasn't looking for anything specific, yet somehow, he felt as if he had been drawn here. Looking for something? The voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of experience without sounding intrusive. Anime turned to see an older man sitting at a small wooden table near the back of the store. He had a book open in front of him, but his gaze was fixed on Anime with quiet interest. His presence was unassuming, yet there was something about him that felt anchored. Anime hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. The old man nodded, as if this was an answer he had heard many times before. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." Anime considered leaving, but something in the man's eyes, calm yet knowing, kept him rooted in place. Slowly, he took the seat. The man closed his book and set it aside. "You seem troubled." Anime let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That obvious?" The man didn't smile, didn't press for details. He simply studied Anime for a moment, then said, "People come here looking for something they can't quite name. It's usually not books." Anime looked down at the table, tracing the wood grain with his fingertip. He didn't want to spill his life story to a stranger. Yet for some reason, he found himself speaking. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I go through the motions. But it all feels pointless. Like I'm just waiting for something to change. But nothing ever does." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's an old teaching. It says that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional." Anime frowned. "What's the difference?" "Pain is what happens to us," the man said. "Suffering is how we respond." The words hung between them, simple yet heavy. Anime sat with them for a moment, turning them over in his mind. "I don't get it," he finally admitted. "You're saying I should just accept feeling this way?" The man shook his head. "I'm saying that maybe the suffering isn't in the feeling. Maybe it's in the way you're holding onto it." Anime didn't respond right away. The idea felt foreign, yet something about it made sense in a way he couldn't quite explain. After a while, the man reached over and picked up his book again. "Think about it," he said. "When you're ready, you'll know what to do next." Anime left the bookstore that night with more questions than answers. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew one thing. He wanted to understand more. The first attempt and failure. Anime sat on the floor of his apartment, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. The room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. He had never done this before, just sitting, doing nothing. It felt strange, almost unnatural. The old man's words from the bookstore echoed in his mind. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. What did that really mean? He had spent the past few days thinking about it, turning it over in his head like a puzzle with missing pieces. If suffering was optional, then why did it feel so constant? Like a background noise he couldn't shut off? He took a slow breath, trying to focus on the rise and fall of his chest. He had read somewhere that paying attention to the breath could quiet the mind. But instead of peace, all he found was restlessness. Thoughts rushed in. Unfinished tasks. Conversations from work. Regrets from years ago. His mind bounced between them like a pinball, each thought pulling him further away from the present. He frowned, forcing himself to return to the breath. Inhale, exhale. But it didn't last. A noise outside, someone slamming a car door, shattered his focus. His mind latched onto it, and suddenly, he was thinking about his neighbor. Then about the rent that was due next week. Then about how tired he felt every morning. Frustration crept in. He was supposed to be meditating, wasn't he? Supposed to be finding clarity, or at least some sort of calm? Instead, he felt like he was fighting his own mind, and he was losing. He opened his eyes and let out a sharp sigh. Maybe this was pointless. Later that day, he decided to try something different. He told himself he would be more mindful at work, more aware of his thoughts before reacting. It sounded simple enough, but within an hour of arriving at the office, he was already caught in old patterns. A coworker sent a passive-aggressive email, and irritation flared in his chest before he even finished reading it. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to fire back a response, something just cutting enough to make his frustration known. Then he hesitated. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Was this suffering? Could he choose not to engage with it? He took a deep breath, telling himself to let it go. But the moment he moved on to another task, his mind dragged him back, replaying the words, crafting comebacks he would never send. His stomach tightened, and by lunch, he had a dull headache. Letting go wasn't as easy as it sounded. That evening, he sat in his car outside his apartment, unwilling to go inside just yet. The day had exhausted him, but not in the usual way. He hadn't done anything physically demanding, yet he felt drained, like his own thoughts had been working against him all day. He leaned his head back against the seat. Was he doing something wrong? Maybe he just wasn't the kind of person who could change. Maybe some people were wired for frustration, for overthinking, for carrying the weight of things they didn't need to carry. As if the universe had been listening, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. If you want to understand water, stop trying to hold it. He sat up, staring at the screen. There was no name attached to the message, no context, yet somehow, it felt relevant. He looked out the windshield at the darkening sky, feeling the weight of his own expectations pressing down on him. Change, it seemed, wouldn't happen overnight. Contemplating the root of suffering, Anime sat in a coffee shop, stirring his drink absent-mindedly, his mind tangled in thoughts. The warm aroma of roasted beans filled the air, blending with the quiet hum of conversations around him. He had been coming here a lot lately, hoping that a change of environment might help clear his thoughts. But today, even the comfort of routine couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him. He had tried, really tried, to put the old man's words into practice, to let things go, to stop clinging to every frustration, every doubt. But no matter how much he told himself to be mindful, his emotions still controlled him. He sighed and looked around the cafe. A young couple sat near the window, laughing over their drinks. At another table, an older woman read a book, completely absorbed. Everyone seemed to be moving through life effortlessly, while he felt like he was stuck in the same loop of self-doubt. Was it really just his thoughts making him miserable? He pulled out his phone and scrolled mindlessly through news headlines, then through social media, pausing on a post that read, "What you resist, persists." He frowned at the words, then glanced up as the barista called out a name. A man in his 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and a presence that felt oddly familiar, stepped forward to grab his drink. Anime recognized him immediately, the old man from the bookstore. Before he could second-guess himself, he stood up and approached. You again, Anime said, surprised at his own boldness. The old man turned, amusement flickering in his eyes. Ah, the wanderer. Anime hesitated before gesturing toward an empty chair at his table. Do you have a minute? The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. A lifetime, if you know how to use it. They sat in silence for a while, the old man sipping his drink, waiting. I tried what you said, Anime finally admitted. The whole, not holding onto things so tightly. But it doesn't work. My thoughts still get the best of me. The old man set his cup down. What do you think is causing your suffering? Anime let out a small, humorless laugh. If I knew that, I wouldn't be here. The man didn't react. He simply leaned back and said, Tell me, have you ever been caught in the rain without an umbrella? Anime blinked at the unexpected question. Yeah, of course. What did you do? What do you mean? I don't know. I tried to run for cover. The old man nodded. Did running stop the rain? Anime frowned. No, but you ran anyway. He sat back, considering this. Are you saying I'm making things worse by reacting? I'm saying suffering isn't in the rain. The old man said, it's in how you fight against getting wet. Anime let the words settle. The rain, the thoughts, the feelings, was he making them bigger just by resisting them? The man continued, there's a story about a traveler who was struck by an arrow. Instead of seeking help, he demanded to know who shot it, why they did it, what kind of wood the arrow was made from. He was so caught up in these questions that he never pulled the arrow out. Anime exhaled, his fingers tightening around his cup. You're saying I've been asking the wrong questions. The old man smiled slightly. I'm saying you've been waiting for the rain to stop, instead of learning to walk in it. The words hit something deep. He had spent so much time believing that happiness was something outside of him, something he had to chase, something he had to fix. But what if the problem had never been the world around him? What if it had always been the way he held onto things? At that moment, a commotion near the entrance pulled his attention. A man in a suit was arguing with the barista. From what Anime could gather, they had gotten his order wrong. The man's voice was sharp, his frustration spilling into every gesture. Anime watched, something clicking into place. Two people could experience the same thing. A wrong coffee order, a rainy day, and yet, their reactions could be completely different. It wasn't the event itself that caused suffering. It was the resistance. The old man stood, as if sensing that their conversation had reached its natural end. The mind is like a cup, he said. If it's already full, nothing new can enter. Anime nodded slowly, absorbing it all, but before he could say anything else, the man gave him a knowing glance and walked out, disappearing into the street like he had never been there. Anime sat there for a long time, watching the steam rise from his coffee, feeling something inside him shift. This wasn't just about changing his thoughts. It was about learning to see differently. And for the first time, he realized he was ready to try. Facing the darkness within, Anime sat on his couch, staring at the dim glow of his television. The volume was low, voices from the screen blending into an indistinct hum. He wasn't watching. His mind was somewhere else, tangled in thoughts he couldn't seem to escape. The past few weeks had been a cycle of hope and frustration. Every time he thought he was making progress, something would pull him back. A moment of clarity would be followed by a surge of irritation over something trivial. A day spent feeling light would end with old doubts creeping back in, whispering that he hadn't really changed at all. He had never paid much attention to the patterns of his own mind before. But now that he was looking, he didn't like what he saw. The impatience, the resentment, the quiet, persistent belief that life had somehow cheated him out of something. Had he always been like this? A memory surfaced, years ago. An argument with an old friend. He had said something cruel in the heat of the moment, something he couldn't take back. At the time, he had justified it to himself. The friend had been wrong. He had deserved it. But now, looking back, Anime wasn't so sure. Had it really been about the argument? Or had it been about something deeper? His own need to be right. To protect his pride? The thought made his stomach tighten. He had spent so much time blaming the world for his unhappiness. But what if the real problem had been inside him all along? The idea was unsettling. It was easier to believe that suffering came from outside, from difficult people, from bad luck, from circumstances beyond his control. But if it was coming from within, then what did that mean? Could he change it? Or was he just built this way? The weight of it pressed down on him. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the unease. A knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, he found the old man from the bookstore standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like someone who could use a conversation," the man said simply. Anime hesitated, then stepped aside. They sat at the small kitchen table, the coffee cups between them. The old man took a slow sip before speaking. "Tell me," he said, "what have you been seeing?" Anime exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Myself, and I don't like what I see." The old man nodded as if he had expected this. "Most people go their whole lives without looking," he said. "They blame everything else. But the moment you turn inward, you start to see the truth." Anime frowned. "And the truth is, what? That I'm just an angry person? That I'm stuck like this?" The old man set his cup down. "There's a story about a monk who carried a heavy sack everywhere he went. One day, someone asked him why he didn't put it down. The monk looked surprised and said, 'I didn't know I was carrying it.'" Anime stared at him, unblinking. The man leaned forward slightly. "Now that you've seen the weight you've been carrying, you have a choice. You can put it down, or you can keep holding onto it." Anime swallowed, his throat dry. "How?" The old man smiled faintly. "You start by understanding that the weight isn't you. It's just something you've been carrying." The words settled deep, but they didn't erase the doubt. Anime looked down at his hands. "What if I don't know how to let go?" The man studied him for a long moment before saying, "Then you keep watching, keep noticing. Darkness only has power when it stays hidden." They sat in silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in. And for the first time, Anime didn't feel like he was running from it. Learning to observe the mind, Anime sat on a bench in the park, watching the wind ripple through the trees. The early morning sun cast long shadows on the grass, and the air was crisp with the scent of damp earth. People passed by, some jogging, some walking their dogs, others lost in their own thoughts. He had come here hoping for quiet, but his mind was anything but. He had been trying, really trying, to follow what the old man had said. Watch his thoughts, let them pass, don't get caught up in them. But it was proving to be harder than he had imagined. Closing his eyes, he took a slow breath and listened to the sounds around him. Birds chirping, distant laughter, the occasional rustling of leaves. For a moment, there was clarity, just the simple awareness of being here. Then his mind wandered. A meeting at work he had been dreading. A text he had forgotten to respond to. An offhand comment someone made that he was now analyzing, wondering if there had been a hidden meaning behind it. He caught himself and tried to return to the present, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. The moment he thought he had it, it slipped away. Frustration crept in. Wasn't this supposed to get easier? He had read somewhere that thoughts were like leaves floating on a river. You weren't supposed to chase them. You were just supposed to watch them drift by. But right now, he felt like he was in the water, being carried away with the current. A deep sigh escaped him. He glanced up as an elderly woman sat down at the other end of the bench. She wore a faded blue jacket, her hands wrapped around a small cup of tea. She seemed at peace, completely at ease with the world around her. Without looking at him, she said, "The wind doesn't mind which way it blows." Anime turned his head. "Excuse me?" She smiled, finally meeting his gaze. "Your mind," she said. "You're fighting it." His brow furrowed. "How do you know that?" She chuckled softly. "I've seen that look before." She took a sip of her tea. "You can't force the mind to be still. You know, it's like a river. It flows whether you want it to or not." Anime exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I've heard that before, but it doesn't help when you're drowning in it." The woman nodded. "Then don't drown." He frowned. "That's easier said than done." She tapped a finger against her cup. "Tell me, when you watch a river, do you jump in to stop it from flowing?" Anime hesitated. "No." "Then why do you do that with your thoughts?" He looked away, staring at the ground. He had never thought about it like that. He had spent so much time trying to control his mind, trying to force himself to be calm, that he hadn't considered another option. "What am I supposed to do instead?" he asked. She smiled. "Sit on the riverbank." A breeze rustled through the leaves, and he let the words settle. Maybe he didn't need to stop the thoughts. Maybe he just needed to stop following them. For the rest of the day, he carried that idea with him. He tried to observe his thoughts the way he observed people passing on the street, acknowledging them, but not chasing after them. At first, it was exhausting. His mind wanted to pull him in, make him react, but every time he caught himself, he gently stepped back, reminding himself that he was just watching. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where he felt something shift. Then the test came. That evening, as he was heading home, his phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. He hadn't spoken to this person in years. Not since their falling out. The message was simple. "I was thinking about the past. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." A rush of emotions hit him all at once. Surprise, uncertainty, and, beneath it all, a flicker of old resentment. His first instinct was to dig up everything, every argument, every moment of hurt. His mind wanted to relive it, to replay all the reasons he had been angry in the first place. But then he stopped. Sit on the riverbank. He took a slow breath. The emotions were still there, swirling inside him, but he didn't have to jump in. He could just watch. His grip on the phone loosened. He read the message again, this time without the weight of the past pressing down on him. And for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to let go. The first success. Anime stood in line at the cafe. The familiar hum of morning chatter filling the space around him. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the distant aroma of baked goods. It was just another ordinary day, or at least, it should have been. He had been coming here for years, always ordering the same thing, always following the same routine. But today, something felt different. He was aware of everything in a way he hadn't been before. The way the barista tapped buttons on the register. The way people's conversations drifted in and out like waves on a shore. He wasn't lost in thought. He was just here. Then it happened. A man behind him muttered something under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it was enough for Anime to catch the irritation in his tone. He turned slightly, just in time to see the man glance at his watch and exhale sharply, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. It was a scene he had witnessed before. The impatience, the frustration of waiting. And then, the man spoke. "Are you gonna order or what?" In the past, that would have been enough to ruin his morning. He would have snapped back, matched the irritation with his own, let the tension seep into his entire day. But this time, something else happened. He felt the annoyance rising. Just for a second. He noticed the sharpness in his chest, the impulse to react, but instead of speaking, He took a breath, a simple, deep inhale, then an exhale, and just like that, the feeling shifted. It wasn't that he didn't feel irritated. He did, but it was distant, like a passing cloud. He saw it, acknowledged it, and let it go. He turned back to the barista and gave his order with a calm smile. The man behind him huffed but said nothing more. Anime walked to the side, waiting for his drink, and something settled inside him. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no grand realization, just a quiet sense of space, of freedom. He had chosen how to respond. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't a prisoner to his own reactions. The moment stayed with him throughout the day. At work, when a coworker made a passive-aggressive comment, he felt the usual flicker of irritation, but it didn't take over. Later, when he got stuck in traffic, he noticed his initial frustration, but instead of letting it boil, he simply accepted that he couldn't change it. He wasn't perfect. He still caught himself falling into old patterns. But there was a difference now, he noticed. And that noticing gave him a choice. That evening, as he walked home, his phone buzzed. He glanced down and felt his chest tighten. The message was from his boss. "Come in early tomorrow. We need to talk." His heart rate picked up. The familiar wave of anxiety crashed over him, his mind already racing with possibilities. Was it bad news? Had he done something wrong? His breathing became shallow. His fingers gripped the phone a little tighter. Then, without thinking, he stopped walking. He closed his eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath. The thoughts were still there, the uncertainty still looming, but he didn't have to drown in it. Just like before, he could watch the river without being swept away. The journey truly begins. Anime sat in his office, staring at the email on his screen. The subject line alone made his stomach tighten. Urgent. Meeting with management at 10 a.m. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't type anything. His mind had already started racing. Had he made a mistake? Was he about to be fired? The logical part of him knew he should wait before jumping to conclusions. But the familiar storm was already brewing inside him. The anxious loop of worst-case scenarios. The tightness in his chest. He inhaled sharply, pushing back from his desk. His phone buzzed on the table. Another message, this time from his landlord. Rent due by Friday. No exceptions. His heartbeat quickened. The weight of everything pressed down on him at once. If he lost his job, how would he pay rent? Would he have to move? Where would he even go? The panic rose, clawing at him. His breath came faster, shallower. His body tensed, bracing for something, though he wasn't sure what. Then, somewhere in the chaos, a quiet thought surfaced. Sit on the riverbank. It was just a whisper. A reminder of what he had been practicing. He closed his eyes and focused on his breath. Inhale, exhale. The thoughts were still there, circling like vultures, but he didn't chase them. He just noticed them, slowly. The tightness in his chest loosened. He wasn't calm, not completely, but he wasn't drowning either. A knock at the door made him jump. His manager, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, stood in the doorway. The meeting's starting. Let's go. He swallowed hard and followed her down the hall, his mind still buzzing. The conference room felt too bright. The long table stretching out before him. A few other employees sat around it, looking just as tense as he felt. His boss, a man known for his bluntness, leaned forward. "We're restructuring," he said. "Some roles are being eliminated." The room went still. Anime's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it, the thing he had been afraid of. The next few minutes blurred together. Talk of budget cuts, shifting priorities. Then his boss turned to him. "Your department is being downsized. You have two options. You can take a severance package and leave, or you can transition into a new role. It won't be the same work, and the pay will be lower." Anime's mind reeled. He had spent years in this job. The idea of leaving, of starting over, it was terrifying. But staying meant accepting something less than what he had built. He felt the familiar pull of fear, the urge to react out of panic. Then, a pause. Sit on the riverbank. For the first time, he didn't immediately grasp at an answer. He let the fear be there without letting it control him. He took a breath. I'll need some time to think about it, he said. His boss gave a curt nod. You have until Friday. The meeting ended, and Anime walked out of the office feeling different. The fear hadn't disappeared. The uncertainty was still there. But something had shifted. He had faced one of his worst fears. And he was still standing. That night, as he sat in his apartment, he thought about everything, his job, his future, the choice ahead of him. And for the first time, he realized something. He wasn't stuck. He had a choice. Overcoming the challenge, Anime sat at his desk, his fingers resting on the keyboard but unmoving. The cursor blinked in the empty email reply box. Waiting for a response he wasn't sure how to give. The words from yesterday's meeting still echoed in his mind. You have until Friday. He had spent the night turning it over, analyzing every possibility. If he left, he'd have to start over somewhere new, uncertain of what lay ahead. If he stayed, he'd be in a position that felt like a step backward. The old version of himself would have spiraled, overthinking, replaying conversations, drowning in self-doubt. But now, he paused. His mind was trying to pull him into fear. He could feel it, like a tide tugging at his feet. But he didn't have to let it carry him away. He inhaled deeply, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. Sit on the riverbank. Instead of reacting, he simply observed. The anxiety was there, but it was just a sensation, temporary, passing. A knock at his office door pulled him out of his thoughts. His coworker, Daniel, stepped in, looking uneasy. Hey, got a second? Anime nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Daniel hesitated before speaking. I heard about the restructure. Have you decided what you're gonna do? Anime leaned back. Not yet. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. Man, I don't know what to do either. They're cutting my role completely. I'll be out by the end of the month. Something in his voice, frustration, maybe even fear, struck a familiar chord in Anime. He had been there before, stuck in the same loop of panic and resistance. But now, as he listened, he realized something. Daniel was reacting the way Anime used to. And for the first time, Anime saw the contrast. Yeah, Anime said carefully. It's a tough situation. Daniel shook his head. I just don't get it. I put in years here. And this is what I get? He let out a bitter laugh. It's not fair. Anime studied him for a moment. He understood the anger, the sense of betrayal, the need to fight against what was happening. But now, he saw it differently. It's frustrating, Anime agreed, but being upset won't change it. Daniel gave him a sharp look. So what, we just accept it? Not accept, Anime said, but maybe stop resisting it. Daniel frowned. What's the difference? Anime thought for a moment, then said, imagine you're caught in a rip current. If you fight against it, you'll exhaust yourself and sink. But if you go with it, you can find a way out. Daniel didn't respond right away. Eventually, he exhaled. I don't know if I can do that. Anime nodded. I didn't think I could either. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel stood, his expression still conflicted but slightly less tense. Thanks, man. I'll see you later. As the door closed behind him, Anime realized something. He had just responded in a way he wouldn't have before. He hadn't tried to fix Daniel's problem. He hadn't absorbed his frustration or let it fuel his own fears. He had simply listened, without getting pulled under. And that was a kind of freedom. Later that evening, he sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. His boss's email was still open, waiting for an answer. The old anxiety tried to creep in. But now, he saw it for what it was. Just a passing wave. He took a deep breath, then typed his response. "I've decided to take the new role." He hit send. The future was still uncertain. The challenges weren't over. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of them. A profound realization. Anime sat on a bench overlooking the river, watching the gentle ripples stretch across the surface. The late afternoon sun painted everything in a golden glow, the warmth settling into his skin. A few months ago, he wouldn't have noticed any of this. His mind would have been elsewhere, caught up in worries, lost in the past or chasing an uncertain future. But now, he was just here. He closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of his breath. Inhale, exhale, no resistance, no urgency to be anywhere else. The meeting with his boss, the fear of change, the uncertainty of his future, it had all felt so overwhelming. But now, as he looked back, it was just another event in the vast, unfolding story of his life. Nothing more, nothing less. His thoughts drifted to the past. He had spent years chasing happiness, believing it was something to be earned, something that came from success, approval, or stability. He had fought against the world, against himself, against reality itself, and in doing so, he had only created suffering. But the suffering hadn't come from the events themselves. It had come from his resistance to them. The river before him flowed effortlessly, adapting to every rock and bend without hesitation. It didn't cling to any particular shape or direction. It simply moved, accepting whatever path lay ahead. For the first time, he understood. Happiness wasn't about making life perfect. It wasn't about avoiding hardship or controlling every outcome. It was about how he chose to meet each moment. A bird landed nearby, pecking at the ground. A few feet away, a man argued on his phone, his voice tight with frustration. A child giggled as she chased after her dog. Life continued, chaotic and beautiful, unchanged by his realizations. But he had changed. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You seem different." Anime turned to see Daniel standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. His coworker looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You don't seem as stressed." Daniel added, "Honestly, I expected you to be freaking out about work." Anime smiled, but it wasn't forced. It was easy, natural. "I guess I just see things differently now." Daniel sat down beside him, frowning slightly. How do you just not care?" "I do care," Anime said. "I just don't fight reality anymore." Daniel gave him a skeptical look. "And that actually helps?" Anime nodded. "It changes everything." They sat in silence for a while, the river flowing steadily before them. For the first time, Anime wasn't looking for answers. He wasn't searching for happiness in some distant future. He had found peace, right here, right now. And he knew, no matter what came next, he would be okay. Sharing wisdom with others. Anime stood in line at the grocery store, his basket filled with a few essentials. The checkout lane was slow, and the woman in front of him shifted impatiently. Tapping her foot, she glanced back, sighed loudly, then turned to the cashier. "Can you go any faster?" she snapped. The cashier, a young girl who couldn't have been more than 18, flinched slightly but kept scanning the items at her usual pace. A few months ago, Anime might have rolled his eyes or silently judged the woman for her impatience. He might have absorbed the irritation around him without realizing it, walking away from the situation feeling tense for no reason at all. But now, he just watched. He saw the tightness in the woman's shoulders, the stress in her eyes. She wasn't just impatient, she was carrying something, a weight he couldn't see, but he could feel. Instead of reacting, he simply waited. When it was finally his turn, the cashier avoided his gaze. Still shaken, Anime offered a small smile. Long day? She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, me too, he said, his voice light. You're doing great. Something in her posture softened. She let out a breath she had probably been holding without realizing it. Thanks. It was such a small moment. But it stayed with him. He hadn't done anything grand. He hadn't lectured the woman on patience or tried to fix the cashier's stress. He had just chosen to meet the moment with kindness instead of frustration. And that choice had shifted something. Maybe not in a huge way, but enough. Later that day, he met Daniel for coffee. His coworker looked different. Less tense than before but still carrying something unspoken. So, Daniel said, stirring his drink, I took your advice. I stopped fighting the situation so much. Anime raised an eyebrow. And? Daniel exhaled. I don't know. It's weird. I still don't like what's happening. But I guess, I don't feel like a victim anymore. Anime nodded. He understood that feeling well. You ever think, Daniel continued, that maybe we spend too much time trying to control things we can't? A small smile touched Anime's lips. Yeah, I used to do that a lot. Daniel studied him for a moment. You're different now. Anime chuckled. Or maybe I'm just seeing things differently. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. As they were about to leave, Daniel paused. You think this whole letting go thing actually works long-term? Anime considered the question. He thought about the woman in the grocery store, about the cashier, about how a simple shift in perspective had changed the way he experienced the world. And he realized something. This wasn't the end of his journey. It never would be. He wasn't done learning, wasn't done growing. There would be more challenges, more moments where old habits tried to resurface. But now, he had a choice, and for the first time, that was enough. Understanding the nature of happiness, Anime sat on a park bench, his hands resting on his lap, watching the world move around him. The late afternoon breeze rustled the leaves, sending golden flecks of sunlight dancing across the pavement. Children played on the swings, their laughter ringing through the air. An elderly couple strolled by, their steps slow but steady. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a soft, melancholic tune. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something. He wasn't searching for an answer, wasn't trying to solve the puzzle of his life. He was simply here, in this moment, fully present. He let out a slow breath, feeling the rise and fall of his chest. Happiness. He had spent so many years chasing it, believing it was something to be earned, something to be achieved. He had thought it lived in external things, success, approval, security. But every time he reached for it, it slipped through his fingers. Now, he understood. Happiness wasn't something to chase. It wasn't some destination he had to reach. It was the space between thoughts, the stillness beneath the noise. It was in the way he chose to meet each moment, not with resistance, but with acceptance. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. A single leaf broke free from a branch, spiraling gently to the ground. He watched it fall, a quiet understanding settling into his bones. Everything was impermanent. The fear, the worry, the endless striving. None of it lasted. Neither did the moments of joy or success. Everything came and went, like waves on a shore, like clouds drifting across the sky. And yet, there was peace in that. Because if nothing lasted, then nothing needed to be held onto. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. You look different, Daniel said, sitting down beside him. Anime turned, offering a small smile. Do I? Daniel nodded. Yeah, lighter. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the world move. Eventually, Daniel spoke again. So, what now? Anime considered the question. There was no grand plan, no final destination, The journey didn't end just because he had learned something new. There would still be challenges. Still be moments of doubt and frustration. But that was okay. Because happiness wasn't about avoiding suffering. It was about how he met it. He looked up at the sky, feeling the cool air on his skin. "I keep going," he said simply. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I guess we all do." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed, and Anime sat there, at peace with it all. Happiness isn't something we find, it's something we realize. Anime's journey wasn't about changing the world around him, but about changing the way he saw it. He learned that peace isn't about avoiding challenges, but about facing them with clarity and acceptance. And just like him, we all have the power to shift our perspective. So, what about you? What's one moment in your life where letting go could bring you peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Buddhism Anime for more stories that inspire wisdom and self-discovery.